Hello, my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby imports and distributors, and welcome to episode 2 of this series about the last years of World War II. 1905 was a pivotal year in Russia, and a year that the actual main revolution could have very well happened. In January 1905, in the city of St. Petersburg, Russian priest, Father, I think it's Garpon or Gapon, led a group of well-behaved demonstrators to hand in a petition to their Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, at the Winter Palace, demanding better working conditions. In the period leading up to this, there had been a number of incidents and series of strikes. So about 3,000 demonstrators started to gather from various points in the city near the Winter Palace. Imperial Russian forces had also gathered in numbers, maybe 10,000. Then, at about 10 a.m. on the 22nd of January 1945, shots were fired into the crowd at various points around the city. The clip from the 1971 Behind Me, Nicholas and Alexander movie, for dramatic purposes, shows the massacre right in front of the Winter Palace. Casualties range from 150 dead to 1,000 dead. But the Bloody Sunday massacre sparked the first Russian Revolution of 1905. The other famous incident in the summer of 1905 was the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. In our previous video on the rise of Japan, we covered the Battle of Tsushima, when the Imperial Russian Navy were completely routed by the Imperial Japanese Navy. This left what remained of the Russian Navy in very poor morale. Sailors around the Black Sea formed Workers' Committee, as this was coupled with the unrest throughout the rest of the empire and the ongoing 1905 revolution. Then on the 27th of June 1905, while at gunnery practice, the sailors refused to eat the meal from maggot-infested meat. The ship's second in command shot one of the mutineers, but the rest turned on the ship's officers and killed most of them. The mutineers then sailed the ship to Romania via Odessa and the Crimea. They then handed the ship over to the Romanian Navy, but not until they scuttled it, and at the same time asking for asylum for the crew. The Russians would get their ship back, and some mutineers were captured, including their leader, who was executed, while some stayed in exile, and even some went to Argentina. The revolution of 1905 took the form of massive strikes, peasant uprising, and unrest throughout Russia, the Russian Empire. But there was also fighting and some bloodletting between the various revolutionary factions. Lenin continued to attend the Social Congress meeting of the RSDLP in London and Stockholm. And while in Russia, forces loyal to the Tsar were brutally putting down the uprising, leading to the deaths of over 15,000 Russians at the hands of Tsarist forces. But there was also 20,000 Russians killed by revolutionary factions in the forms of bloodletting and against those who in Russia were loyal to the Tsar. There was also massive arguments between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and how to conduct the revolution, with Lenin's Bolsheviks wanting terror, insurrection, violence and criminality to help the cause, such as the robbing of banks, post offices and the railways. One of the leading robbers for the Bolshevik cause was no other than Georgian Joseph Stalin. Though the 1905 revolution did not overthrow the Tsar, it did lead to reforms called the October Manifesto, under protest from Tsar Nicholas II, having been encouraged by his own nobility and statesmen. This gave a constitution, an elected parliament called the Duma, and forms of civil rights. It also staved off revolution for a while. Two folks crawling up the greasy pole of revolution were Leon Trotsky and, as I say, mentioned Joseph Stalin, who by the end of the 1905 revolution, in around about 1906-1907, were now both making their way in and around Lenin. Trotsky, the more political animal, went down the Soviet or Workers' Council and the RSDLP Congress and periods overseas from, say, 1907 to 1914. Stalin, though still a bit of a robber dog, was in and out of prison and exile in Siberia. Stalin was important, though, to Lenin, as he thought Stalin would be useful as a Georgian to know what to do with all the ethnic thoughts in the empire after the revolution. Stalin was elected to the first Bolshevik committee in 1912 while still in exile, and in the period converted the Bolshevik newspaper from Zvezda, Star, to Pravda, the Truth. For all the unrest at home in Russia, with the Bolsheviks and other factions, the Russian army was massive, over 1.4 million full-time soldiers and potential to mobilise up to 5 million. Russia, along with its allies France and the United Kingdom, declared war on Germany and the Central Powers in August 1914. Tsar Nicholas II thought the war would be good for his rule and strengthen his authority, and there was some patriotic upturn and the Russian army marched off to war. But the Russian equipment was overall very poor and had very few motor transports and suffered from poor supply problems. And when they did meet the German army, they were generally soundly beaten, such as the Battle for Tannenberg in August 1914, which saw the complete destruction of the Russian Second Army. They had more success against the Austro-Hungary forces, such as the Battle of Galicia in what is now Poland and Ukraine. But after this, the war went into a stalemate. Tsar Nicholas took over the command of the army, while his wife, Alexander, entertained herself with some mad monk called Rasputin. Her German origins did not go down well with normal Russian people, and the war was not going well by the end of 1916. So we'll now look at the February Revolution, or March Revolution, depending which calendar, be the Julian calendar or the Gregorian calendar. While the Russian army was freezing in late 1916 and early 1917 on the front lines, there was unrest in St. Petersburg, now named Petrograd, as its former name sounded too German. And there were mass demonstrations against food shortages. There were soon violent clashes with police and forces loyal to the Tsar, but the soldiers from the main garrison sided with the revolutionaries. Leaving members of the Duma, or left-leaning members of the Duma, formed a provisional government and seized the telegraph and railway stations, thus stopping trains from getting forces loyal to the Tsar to the capital. The Tsar himself and his family were actually on the way on a train back to Petrograd, but were held up and by his officers forced to abdicate there and then. In just 10 days, the dynasty of the Tsars from 1547 was over. It was 10 days that shook the world. The new government was very unpopular and were soon forced to share power with the Petrograd Workers' Soviet Council. And in July 1917, there was a series of armed demonstrations by soldiers and sailors and industrial workers against the government. Alexander Kerensky became head of government, but had problems with food shortages, unemployment, and his support for keeping the Russians in the Great War. Meanwhile, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were making their plans, and Lenin had arrived back to Petrograd in April 1917 to some fanfare to talk to various revolutionary factions, but was accused of being a German adjunct provocateur by the provincial government and had to make his escape. Behind me from the movie Nicholas and Alexander 1971 is Lenin's return to Petrograd. In August 1917, General Kornilov, commander of the Russian army, had sent troops to Petrograd in the form of a coup, but the provincial government turned to the Petrograd Soviets to form Red Guards to defend the city. This included members of the Bolshevik fraction. And by September 1917, the Mensheviks and Socialist revolutionaries were losing support due to their ties with the provincial government and its continued support of the war. So the Bolsheviks made the most of this and soon were in control of the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin returned to Petrograd in October 1917, where he addressed the Bolshevik Central Committee, asking for armed insurrection to topple the provisional government. And this was won by a vote of 10-2. The Bolsheviks made their plans with the Military Revolutionary Council, or the Red Guards, that were formed in the recent coup. The Military Revolutionary Council was ordered to take control of the Petrograd's key areas such as transport, communications and printing facilities, and did this without a lot of bloodshed. The Red Guards then stormed the Winter Palace to arrest ministers of the provincial government. The cruiser Aurora fired a blank shot to signal the start of the Bolshevik Revolution. Behind me is an old movie, The Storming of the Winter Palace by the Red Guards, starting with the firing of the shot by the warship Aurora. The Bolsheviks soon formed a new government and Lenin wanted Trotsky to be its leader, but most of the Bolshevik committee wanted Lenin, so he took the job. We shall now look at the Russian Civil War. The new government under Lenin's task was to stop war with Germany and the Central Powers, as Russian army had kind of had enough of the war and the Germans were in a better position. So, in late 1917, an armistice was signed with Trotsky in attendance and the fighting stopped. But in February 1918, the Germans started advancing again into Russian territory, and this convinced Lenin to accept whatever the Central Powers demanded. So on the 3rd of March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed and Russia withdrew from World War I, leaving the Germans to send masses of divisions over to the Western Front to start Operation Michael. No sooner than Lenin and the Bolsheviks were in power, fractions against the Bolsheviks, with the help of former Tsarist officers, formed the what called White Armies to oppose the newly formed Red Army led by Trotsky. The White Army were joined by thousands of British, French, US, Canadian, Italians, Polish, Serbs who landed in Murmansk, while even more British, US and Japanese forces landed at Vladivostok. A large Czech force of former Austro-Hungarian prisoners muted against the Bolsheviks and controlled a lot of eastern Russia. It was during the Russian Civil War that the fate of the former Tsar unfolded. After his abdication, Tsar Nicholas II and his family and loyal retainers were detained by the provincial government and moved to one of their smaller palaces near Petrograd, and for a while they lived most reasonably with their servants. They were supposed to go into exile, and Britain was being the obvious choice, as King George V was the Tsar's cousin. But UK politicians were having none of that, and even the king was somewhat uneasy. With the political situation changing and riots in Petrograd, Russian Prime Minister Kerensky moved them to Siberia in August 1917. Now with the Bolsheviks in power, they were moved again, this time to Ekaterinburg, to the House of Special Purpose. Here they were treated more like prisoners under stricter conditions. On the morning of the 17th of July 1918, they were taken to the basement and executed by firing squad. Actually, some of the ladies, because they wore bigger dresses, didn't die by the bullet and had to be bayoneted. But they were executed as the white forces were getting closer and closer, and the Bolsheviks didn't want to be captured. Much of the Russian Civil War was fought around railway lines in the vast interior of the south and east, known as the Train War. British Minister Winston Churchill wanted a full-scale invasion and defeat of the Bolsheviks in Russia. But the British, French and US governments did not want to put any more blood and treasure into an almost ending war. They started to withdraw their forces by the spring of 1918, but were willing to support those fighting the Bolsheviks and help a series of independent countries in the east to block the spread of Bolshevism. So, against the Bolsheviks were a group of fractions, some not trusting each other, monarchists, liberals, social democrats and others who just did not like the Bolsheviks. They also moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow to be further away from the enemy and more central into the Bolshevik stronghold. This bitter war would last until 1922, including another war at the same time with Poland and Serbia, and would cost of upwards of 12 million casualties, including disease and famine, and the massacre of Jews in Ukraine and southern Russia by white forces. In the end, for all the problems the Bolsheviks had, the white forces were too fractured, and in the end failed to stop the revolution at massive cost in human terms. And by 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was formed, and over the next decade was diplomatically recognised by the main countries in the West. As Lenin's health started to fail, he recommended that Stalin be removed as general head of the Communist Party and Trotsky to be given the job. But Stalin had his supporters, and after Lenin's death in 1924, there was a bit of a power struggle, and Stalin saw Trotsky as his main rival and absolutely despised him. Stalin did an unofficial alliance with some senior party members, and there was various moves and alliances until Trotsky was removed from the Communist Central Committee and exiled in 1928, leaving Stalin as supreme leader of party and state. In episode 3, we shall look at Stalin's grip on power and the 5-year plans, his purges and his brief alliance with Germany and the invasion of the now Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 by the Nazis.